The courtroom was filled with people that morning. Some had come for their own cases, some were waiting to testify, and others were there out of curiosity. The heavy wooden doors opened slowly, and a young black man stepped inside. His clothes were plain, just a simple shirt and trousers. He carried no expensive briefcase, no shiny shoes like the lawyers who were already seated. In his hand was only a thick stack of papers, held together with a rubber band. He walked quietly toward the front, his steps calm but steady. The judge, sitting high on the bench, looked at him with raised eyebrows. There was a quick smile, almost a laugh, as if the sight was unusual. Around the courtroom, whispers started. A few people leaned closer to one another, muttering words that made the man's entrance feel heavier than it should have been. It was as if many had already decided he had no chance, no matter what those papers in his hand contained. The man did not look at them. He kept his eyes straight, focused only on the desk where he was supposed to stand. His face carried no sign of nervousness, though inside his chest his heart was beating quickly. It was not fear, but the awareness of the moment. He knew very well what people expected of him. They thought he would stumble, that he would not understand the rules, and that he would be embarrassed in front of everyone. The judge cleared his throat and leaned back in the large chair. "So," he said with a voice that echoed across the room, "you are here without a lawyer." His tone had a hint of amusement, as though the idea itself was funny. Some in the crowd chuckled softly. The man simply nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor, I will represent myself." His voice was steady, respectful, but firm enough to be heard clearly. The judge raised one eyebrow again, shaking his head slightly. "This is not a traffic ticket," he said, his smile now visible to everyone. "You understand what you are up against. Do you really believe you can handle this by yourself?" His words carried weight, but behind them was also doubt, even mockery. It was as if he wanted the man to second-guess his own decision before the case even began. The man looked down at the papers in his hand, then back up at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe I can." His calm response brought a short silence to the room. For a moment, even those whispering stopped. The judge gave a small laugh and shook his head once more. "Well," he said, "we will see." The case was called, and the man moved closer to the table reserved for defense. He laid down his papers neatly, arranging them with care. Each sheet had handwritten notes, some typed documents, and highlighted lines. They were not the polished documents of a law office, but they were organized. He placed them in order, knowing he would need each one at the right time. As he stood there, people watched him closely. Some shook their heads, already predicting failure. Others smirked, waiting for mistakes. A few, however, looked curious, as though they wondered what made him confident enough to face a courtroom without the shield of a lawyer. The judge leaned forward again, resting his chin on one hand. "You know," he said slowly, "there is an old saying, 'He who represents himself has a fool for a client.' Do you know that saying?" His voice was calm, but the words were sharp. Laughter rose from a corner of the room, though quickly hushed. The man's eyes remained steady. "I have heard it, Your Honor," he replied. "But sometimes, nobody understands your case better than yourself." That sentence, simple yet bold, caught even the judge off guard. He leaned back again, tapping the gavel softly on the desk, and said nothing more for the moment. The clerk read the details of the case. It was not a small matter, and that was why the judge's reaction had been so strong. Normally, people would hire a lawyer, someone with years of training. But this man had chosen another path. He had studied alone, reading books, going through old cases, and writing down every point he thought might matter. He had spent nights without sleep, going over the laws line by line until they were clear in his head. He did not come unprepared, even if his appearance made people think otherwise. Still, The courtroom atmosphere was against him. People whispered again, this time about his calmness. Some thought it was foolish pride. Others thought it was bravery. But no one, not even the judge, believed yet that he truly had the skill to stand there. When the prosecutor entered with polished shoes, crisp suit, and a voice full of authority, the difference was clear. He carried only a thin file, confident he would not need more. After all, his opponent was just a man without a lawyer, a man who seemed out of place in the grand room with its tall windows and echoing walls. The prosecutor gave the judge a polite nod, then glanced at the man standing across from him. His smile was brief, but it carried the same doubt the judge had shown. It was the smile of someone who believed the battle was already won. The judge asked the man again, "You still wish to continue without counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor," the man repeated, his voice calm. "Very well," the judge replied, his tone softer but still doubtful. "Then let us begin." The man adjusted his papers, took a slow breath, and stood tall. He was ready, even if no one else thought so. Around him, the courtroom waited. Some were ready to laugh again, expecting mistakes. Some leaned forward with interest. The air was heavy with expectation, the kind that fills a room before something important is about to happen. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, then at the man. He tapped the gavel once more and said, "Proceed." At that very moment, the man lifted his first sheet of paper. His hands were steady, his eyes clear. He had walked into the courtroom as someone people doubted. He now stood at the edge of proving them wrong. The whispers died down as everyone leaned closer. No one knew what words would come next, but the atmosphere had shifted slightly. It was no longer only about doubt. There was now a spark of curiosity, even from the judge who had laughed before. The man cleared his throat softly. He was about to begin speaking, and with those first words, he would either confirm the expectations of failure or start changing the minds of everyone present. The room grew still. The sound of paper rustling in his hand was the only noise. All eyes were on him, and though he stood alone, he did not feel small. Inside, he remembered the long nights at his desk, the endless hours at the library, and the determination that brought him here. He thought of the people who told him he would not succeed, who doubted his ability to understand the law. He thought of the quiet strength he carried, built not on titles or expensive suits, but on preparation, focus, and belief in himself. Now, in that courtroom, with the judge still holding back a smile, with the prosecutor ready to strike, and with the crowd waiting to see a failure, he opened his mouth and prepared to speak. And in that moment, the entire courtroom leaned in, ready to witness something none of them had expected. The young man adjusted the stack of papers in front of him, his hands calm but sure. The judge leaned slightly forward, still holding a faint smile as if he expected a quick collapse. The prosecutor sat back in his chair, waiting for the man to stumble on his very first sentence. The air was still thick with doubt, but the man stood tall, looking directly at the judge before speaking. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm but respectful, "I understand that representing oneself in court is not common. But I ask that you allow me the chance to present my case. I believe the truth and the law are both on my side." His words carried weight, and the silence in the courtroom grew deeper. People in the back row shifted in their seats, now paying closer attention. They had come expecting a short, predictable scene, but there was something different about the way he spoke. There was no panic, no trembling. His tone was balanced, controlled, and confident. The judge gave a short nod. "Go ahead," he said, though his tone still held doubt. The man reached for his first paper, unfolded it carefully, and looked at the judge again. "Your Honor," he continued, "this case may seem straightforward, but the details tell another story. I will show you step by step how the accusations are not only weak but also unsupported by the very laws of the state." The prosecutor smirked, ready to challenge him. But the man carried on, not once looking shaken. He began explaining the background of the case in plain words that everyone could follow. He described events clearly, using times, dates, and specific details. Every sentence seemed carefully chosen, as though he had practiced them in front of a mirror 100 times before. The judge raised his eyebrows slightly, impressed at the clarity. Most people who came without lawyers often struggled to find the right words, stumbling over legal terms or confusing the timeline. But this man spoke in a way that was easy to understand while still sharp and logical. He avoided unnecessary words, focusing only on what mattered most. At one point, the prosecutor interrupted. "Objection, Your Honor," he said quickly, "the defendant is misrepresenting the facts." The judge looked down at the man. "Do you have a response?" The man gave a small nod, turning one page over. "Yes, Your Honor. If the prosecution believes I am misrepresenting the facts, I invite him to show where exactly I have done so. But if I may, I have with me copies of the original documents." He held them up. "They confirm the details I have just presented. I will submit them to the court." The clerk came forward to collect the papers. The judge glanced at them briefly, then back at the prosecutor. "The record seems consistent with his statement," he said calmly. The prosecutor's smirk faded. People in the courtroom shifted again. Some were surprised, others impressed. A few nodded silently, as if they were beginning to root for the man. The man continued, turning to his second point. He spoke about the specific laws that applied to his case. To everyone's shock, he quoted the exact section numbers. He even referenced the year the laws were updated and explained how they were relevant. His voice remained steady, and every explanation was broken down into simple terms, almost like a teacher guiding students. The judge, who had once been leaning back with a smile, was now sitting up straighter. His pen tapped against the desk as he listened. The amusement on his face had vanished, replaced with focus. The prosecutor tried again to interrupt. "Your Honor, the defendant is not a licensed lawyer. I don't believe he should be allowed to." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "He is making his points clearly and with reference to law. Unless you can prove otherwise, I will allow him to continue." The courtroom grew even quieter. The respect in the judge's voice was clear, and it changed the mood instantly. The man continued, moving through his papers, each one neatly marked with notes and highlights. He spoke of precedent cases, even mentioning their names and years. He explained how in those cases, the judges had made rulings that matched the logic he was presenting. Each time he spoke, his words flowed naturally, as if he had rehearsed them many times. Whispers began in the back again, but this time they were not mocking. They were filled with surprise. People were saying things like, "How does he know all this, and he speaks better than some lawyers I've seen." The judge leaned forward once more. "You said the law is on your side. Show me, in your own words, how you believe it protects you in this situation." The man took a deep breath, then spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, the law is meant to protect every citizen equally, regardless of whether they can afford a lawyer or not. The Constitution guarantees the right to defend oneself, and it also guarantees fairness. I have studied every detail of this case, and the evidence against me does not meet the standards the law requires. I will show you that step by step." The way he said it brought a quiet strength to the room. There was no arrogance, no anger, only conviction. The judge nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. As the man laid out more points, it became clear that his preparation was deeper than anyone expected. He not only defended himself but also began pointing out small errors in the way the prosecutor had filed the case. He showed how certain documents were missing dates, how signatures were unclear, and how some statements did not line up with official records. He placed each paper before the judge in order, explaining them patiently. The judge flipped through them, his eyes narrowing. He was beginning to see what others had missed. The prosecutor, once confident, now shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The man's calmness never broke. He stood there, turning one page after another, explaining the truth behind each. He never raised his voice, never rushed. Each word was deliberate, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. By now, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. The laughter and doubt that had filled the air earlier were gone. People were leaning forward, fascinated by what they were witnessing. The man who was mocked for standing alone was now holding the entire room's attention. The judge finally leaned back, placing the papers down. "This is unusual," he admitted aloud. "But I must say, you are presenting your case with remarkable clarity. Please continue." Those words stunned the room. The same judge who had laughed at him earlier was now praising him in front of everyone. The man nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, before moving to his next point. Inside, he felt a quiet sense of victory, but he did not show it. He knew this was only the beginning, and the road was still long. Yet, for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, he felt the tide turning in his favor. And so, as the morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows and lit up the papers on the desk, the man stood in the center of the courtroom, not as someone underestimated, but as someone slowly revealing his hidden strength. The prosecutor shifted in his chair, his confidence no longer shining as brightly as before. He had walked into the courtroom certain this case would be easy, certain that facing a man without a lawyer would be nothing more than routine. Yet now, he found himself scribbling notes quickly, looking through his file again and again, hoping to find a detail that could shake the calm and steady voice that had just dismantled so many of his arguments. The judge, who earlier had leaned back with a smile, was now leaning forward on the bench, eyes fixed on the man standing at the defense table. The quiet amusement was gone. His gavel rested gently on the desk as his fingers tapped thoughtfully against it. For the first time since the case began, the weight of seriousness hung heavy in the room. The young man lifted another page from his stack of papers. His eyes moved carefully over the words he had written during long nights of study. He looked up at the judge and then at the prosecutor. His voice was steady as he spoke again. "Your Honor, the prosecution claims that the evidence against me is solid. But if we look closely, not only is the evidence incomplete, it is also inconsistent with the law." He paused to let the words sink in. Then, without rushing, he continued, "Take for example, Exhibit B." He lifted one of the documents from the pile and held it up. "This document was submitted as proof against me. But if you look closely at the date, it does not match the timeline that the prosecution himself presented." The judge gestured for the clerk to bring the paper forward. He placed his glasses on and studied the document carefully. The man continued speaking, explaining every detail. "The prosecution argued that this event happened on June 5th. But this document clearly says June 7th. That is a 2-day difference, Your Honor. And when you compare it with other records, the story no longer fits." The prosecutor quickly stood up. "Your Honor, this is a minor error. It does not change the fact that..." The man raised his hand slightly, respectfully, and said, "With permission, Your Honor, may I respond?" The judge nodded. "Errors are not minor when they are the foundation of the case," the man said firmly. "If the prosecution cannot even keep the dates consistent, how can we trust the rest of the evidence? In law, details matter. And these details show that their story does not hold." A murmur ran through the courtroom. People whispered to one another, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some looked at the prosecutor with doubt, while others looked at the man with growing respect. The judge raised his eyebrows, then looked at the prosecutor. "Counsel, how do you explain this inconsistency?" The prosecutor stumbled over his words. It must have been a clerical mistake, Your Honor. The facts remain unchanged." The judge shook his head slightly. Mistakes like these weaken your case. The defendant's point is valid. The prosecutor sat down heavily, his face tight with frustration. The man continued, his voice never losing its calm rhythm. He pulled out another document, highlighting yet another error. This time, it was a missing signature. He explained how official documents required proper verification, and without a signature, their credibility could not be accepted. Again, the judge looked at the papers and nodded slowly. "That is correct," he said. The man moved on, quoting a legal case from 5 years earlier. He spoke the name of the case and the year, then summarized its ruling in plain words. "In that case, Your Honor, the court ruled that evidence with missing verification could not be used. If the same principle applies here, then these documents cannot stand." The judge scribbled notes, his expression thoughtful. The prosecutor leaned back, arms crossed, his earlier smile gone completely. The courtroom atmosphere was changing fast. What had begun as a scene of doubt and laughter was turning into a lesson, a display of knowledge that no one had expected. The people in the benches leaned forward, eager to hear the next point. Some even nodded quietly in agreement with the man's words. The judge finally spoke again. "You seem well prepared. Where did you learn all this?" The man paused for a moment before answering. "Your Honor, I do not have formal training. But I believe that knowledge is available to anyone willing to seek it. I spent long nights reading law books, studying cases, and learning how the system works. I may not have a law degree, but I have the truth, and I have the law in my hands." Those words carried power. They echoed across the room, and for a moment, even the judge sat silently, reflecting. The prosecutor stood once more, determined to regain control. He began firing questions at the man, one after another. "Do you know the exact wording of Section 14, Clause 3? Do you know what the appellate court ruled in the Harris v. State case of 2009? Do you understand the difference between circumstantial and direct evidence?" Each time, the man replied calmly. He quoted the wording. He explained the appellate court ruling. He broke down the difference between circumstantial and direct evidence in simple, precise terms. The prosecutor's voice grew sharper with each failed attempt to trip him up, but the man answered without hesitation. The judge lifted a hand. "Enough, counselor," he said firmly. "The defendant has answered clearly. He is not only aware of the law, he understands it deeply." The prosecutor sank back into his seat. By now, the judge was no longer laughing. His face showed respect, even admiration. The man's knowledge had shifted the balance of the courtroom. What was once seen as weakness had now become strength. The man continued presenting his arguments, one after another, each supported by documents, by laws, by cases. His words were not just defense, they were a mirror showing the cracks in the prosecution's case. He remained composed, never raising his voice, never rushing, always steady. By midday, the energy in the courtroom had transformed completely. People who had walked in expecting a simple trial were now witnessing something extraordinary. The man who had been underestimated, even laughed at, was standing tall as an equal to the lawyers in the room. The judge finally called for a short recess. The gavel struck, and people stood, buzzing with whispers. Some shook their heads in amazement, others smiled, clearly impressed. Even those who had doubted him at first could not deny what they had just seen. The man gathered his papers slowly, carefully placing them back in order. He did not smile, but his eyes showed a quiet confidence. He knew the fight was not over, but he also knew he had earned something important that morning: the respect of the courtroom. As he sat down, he thought about the long path that had brought him there. The nights spent in the library, the hours reading legal texts, the countless notes scribbled in margins. He remembered the moments of exhaustion, the doubts he had fought in his own mind. All of it had led to this moment. And now, with the judge no longer laughing, with the prosecutor struggling, he felt the strength of his effort shining through. When the judge returned, the room grew silent once more. The trial was far from finished, but the balance had shifted. The man was no longer seen as helpless. He was now seen as a fighter with knowledge, with truth, with the courage to stand alone. And as the judge struck the gavel again, calling the court back into session, the man knew that the hardest part was yet to come. But he was ready. He was prepared to face every question, every challenge, and to continue proving that brilliance and determination could break even the deepest doubts. The judge's gavel struck the desk as the courtroom returned to session after the recess. The air was heavier than before, filled with curiosity and quiet respect. What had started as a case that many thought would be over quickly had turned into something none of them had expected. The man who had walked in without a lawyer, carrying nothing but his papers, had already shown that he was no ordinary defendant. He stood again as the judge called him forward. His papers were neatly arranged, his face calm. The prosecutor adjusted his tie nervously, knowing that the second half of the trial would be even more difficult. The man's earlier points had not only shaken the foundation of the prosecution's case but had also begun to shift the judge's perspective. The judge leaned forward. "You may continue," he said, his tone no longer mocking but steady and respectful. The man gave a small nod and picked up his next set of notes. "Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to address the testimony that was submitted earlier." The prosecution brought witnesses whose statements, at first glance, seemed to strengthen their argument. But if we look closely, Your Honor, we will see that these statements contradict each other. He unfolded a page, his finger pointing to a line highlighted in yellow. This witness claimed the event happened at 3 p.m. But another witness stated it happened closer to 5 p.m. That is not a small difference. It changes the entire sequence of events. If we cannot establish when the event happened, how can we believe the rest of the testimony is accurate? The judge signaled for the clerk to bring forward the witness statements. He read them carefully, comparing the times. His lips pressed together. "That is correct," he admitted softly. "The times do not match." The prosecutor quickly stood. "Your Honor, people sometimes make mistakes when recalling times. That does not mean the testimony is unreliable." The man remained calm. "Your Honor, memory may not be perfect, but when witnesses are supposed to strengthen the same story, their words should align. Here, the differences are not minor, they are central to the case. If one says afternoon and another says evening, then the truth is unclear. And in law, doubt must favor the accused." The judge nodded slowly, his pen tapping against the desk. "Point taken." A quiet murmur swept the courtroom again. The man's steady voice, his logic, and his courage to stand against the prosecutor were winning the respect of everyone present. He turned another page. "Furthermore, Your Honor, one witness admitted to being more than 50 feet away from the event. Another admitted it was dark at the time. How can their testimony be considered reliable when they themselves admit their view was limited?" The prosecutor rose again, his tone sharper now. "Your Honor, these are small technicalities. The witnesses still confirm the main facts." The man responded quickly, his tone respectful but firm. "With permission, Your Honor, I disagree. The law requires more than guesses. If a witness cannot clearly see or recall, then their testimony is not proof. It is opinion. And in a case such as this, opinions cannot replace facts." The judge looked at the papers again, his eyes narrowing. He turned toward the prosecutor. "Counsel, the defendant is correct. Testimony that cannot be verified is weak. You should have ensured your witnesses were reliable." The prosecutor's shoulders sank. He looked down, flipping through his file with frustration. The man continued. His words flowed like water, steady and smooth. He spoke of fairness, of how the justice system was designed to protect all people equally. He reminded the court that wealth or status should not determine truth. He explained how the evidence had failed again and again to meet the standard required by law. As he spoke, people in the audience began to nod. Some leaned closer to hear every word. It was not only the strength of his arguments but also the way he carried himself with dignity, patience, and respect that moved the room. The judge, who had once laughed at the sight of him standing alone, now sat completely serious, his eyes following the man's every word. It was clear that he was no longer looking at him as someone out of place. He was looking at him as someone who had earned the courtroom's full attention. The prosecutor, desperate, tried once more to strike back. He stood and asked rapid-fire questions, hoping to confuse the man. "What about Section 24, Clause 6? Do you know how it applies here? What about the ruling from last year's appellate case? Are you familiar with it? What about the technical difference between admissible and inadmissible hearsay?" The man did not flinch. He answered each question calmly. He quoted the law. He explained the appellate case clearly, even summarizing how it was similar but not identical to his own situation. He broke down the legal terms so simply that even the people in the back row could understand. The judge raised his hand once again, silencing the prosecutor. "Enough," he said firmly. "The defendant has answered every question with clarity. He has shown full understanding of the law. I will not allow further attempts to derail his presentation." The prosecutor sank back into his chair, defeated. The man picked up his final set of notes. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Your Honor, I am not standing here because I think I am greater than the law. I am standing here because I believe in the law. I believe that truth matters. And the truth is that the prosecution's case is broken, piece by piece. Their documents are inconsistent. Their witnesses contradict one another. Their evidence lacks proper verification. And according to the law, when doubt exists, the court must decide in favor of the accused." The courtroom was silent now, the kind of silence that comes when everyone knows they are witnessing something remarkable. The man placed his papers down, folded his hands, and stood quietly, waiting. The judge sat back slowly, his face unreadable. He looked at the documents, then at the man, then at the prosecutor. After a long pause, he said, "I must admit, I did not expect this. I thought you would struggle. I even made light of your choice to represent yourself. But you have demonstrated extraordinary preparation, clarity, and understanding of the law. This court recognizes your efforts." The words fell heavy across the room. Some people gasped quietly. Others exchanged looks of amazement. The man himself gave only a respectful nod, but inside, he felt the weight of those words deeply. The judge tapped his gavel softly. "We will proceed to final arguments tomorrow. But I must say this: the defense has already raised serious doubts about the prosecution's case." The gavel struck again, ending the day's session. As people rose from their seats, whispers filled the air. "Did you hear how he answered?" one person said. "He knew more than the prosecutor," said another. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others smiled, clearly inspired by what they had just seen. The prosecutor packed his things quickly, avoiding eye contact. The man, however, carefully gathered his papers, placing them neatly back in order. He walked slowly toward the exit, his steps calm, his head held high. The same judge who had laughed at him that morning had now praised him. The same crowd that had doubted him now looked at him with respect. The courtroom had been transformed, and so had he. Outside, the evening light painted the sky with soft colors. The man paused at the steps, breathing deeply. Tomorrow would be the final test. But no matter what happened, he knew he had already achieved something priceless. He had shown that dignity, preparation, and knowledge could silence doubt and command respect. And tomorrow, he was determined to finish what he had started. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the courtroom as the final day of the trial began. People filled the benches earlier than usual, eager to witness what many were calling one of the most surprising cases in recent memory. Word had spread quickly about the man who had walked into court alone, laughed at by some, doubted by most, yet who had stood like a seasoned lawyer and defended himself with brilliance. When the young black man entered, his clothes were the same as before, simple, neat, but nothing fancy. His papers were stacked tightly in his hands, the same ones he had studied night after night. This time, however, the whispers in the courtroom were different. They were no longer mocking. They carried tones of respect, even admiration. Some nodded as he walked past, as if silently cheering him on. The prosecutor sat stiffly at his table, flipping through his file with nervous energy. His earlier confidence had been shaken badly. He knew this day would be difficult. The judge, seated high above, was already looking serious, his face calm but watchful. Gone was the playful smirk, gone was the laughter. His eyes now carried respect for the man standing before him. The gavel struck. "Court is in session," the judge said. "We will hear final arguments." The prosecutor went first. He stood, straightened his tie, and tried to recover his old tone of authority. He spoke about the importance of the law, about responsibility, about how the evidence pointed in one direction. His words were strong, but his delivery lacked the fire it once had. Everyone in the room could feel it. The weight of doubt hung over him. He spoke for several minutes, yet nothing he said seemed to land with the force he hoped. When he finally sat down, the room turned to the man who stood alone at the defense table. Slowly, he rose to his feet, collected his papers, and stepped forward. He took a deep breath, glanced once at the judge, then at the audience, and began. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and strong, "this trial has been about more than just me. It has been about whether the truth can stand, even when people doubt the one who speaks it. From the beginning, I was seen as someone unprepared, someone who would not understand. But I knew the truth, and I trusted the law." The courtroom grew silent, hanging on his every word. He lifted one of his papers. "We saw that the documents used against me contained errors. We saw dates that did not match, signatures that were missing. These are not small mistakes, they are the foundation of the case. If the foundation is cracked, the house cannot stand." He placed the paper down, then lifted another. "We also saw that the witnesses contradicted one another. One said the event happened in the afternoon, another said in the evening. One admitted it was dark and they could not see clearly. If their words do not agree, then their testimony is not truth, it is only opinion. And the law does not allow opinion to decide a man's fate." The judge nodded slowly, his pen pausing over his notes. The man continued, his voice steady, almost like a teacher guiding a classroom. "We also discussed the law itself. The law says evidence must be verified, and it was not. The law says doubt must favor the accused, and there is more than enough doubt here. The law is not about guessing, it is about proof." He paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Everyone was listening, even the prosecutor, who sat with his head low. "Your Honor," the man said finally, his voice carrying deep conviction, "I did not come here with expensive suits or professional training. I came here with faith in truth and with preparation. I studied because I believed my voice mattered, even if others doubted it. And I stand here today asking not for mercy, but for justice. I ask for a fair judgment, based on the law and the facts." His words filled the room like a quiet storm. No one moved, no one whispered. It was as if time itself had paused to listen. The man slowly placed his papers down, folded his hands, and stood tall. He had spoken his last words, and now it was in the hands of the judge. The judge leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. He looked at the man, then at the prosecutor, then down at the papers spread before him. The room held its breath. Finally, the judge spoke. This court has heard both sides. The prosecution presented its case, but it contained inconsistencies and weaknesses that cannot be ignored. The defendant, representing himself, has shown remarkable clarity, preparation, and respect for the law. He has not only defended himself but also revealed serious flaws in the prosecution's evidence. He paused, his eyes meeting the man's. This court cannot in good conscience find guilt where doubt is so clear. Therefore, the charges are dismissed. The gavel struck loudly. The sound echoed through the room, followed by gasps, then a wave of murmurs. Some people clapped softly before stopping themselves, remembering where they were. Others smiled, shaking their heads in amazement. The prosecutor closed his file quietly, his face pale with defeat. The man stood still for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then, slowly, he exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. He bowed his head slightly to the judge and said, "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge looked at him with something more than respect, it was admiration. "You have reminded this court of something important," the judge said quietly. "That justice is not about appearance, but about truth. You may leave this courtroom with your head held high." As the man gathered his papers and walked toward the doors, people moved aside for him. Their eyes followed him with respect, not doubt. Some whispered words like, "Incredible," and "He knew more than the lawyers." Others simply watched, silent, realizing they had witnessed something rare and powerful. When he stepped outside into the daylight, the cool breeze touched his face. He paused on the courthouse steps, closing his eyes for a moment. It was over. The long nights of study, the doubt he had faced, the laughter he had endured, all of it had led to this moment of freedom and victory. But it was more than just a personal win. It was proof that knowledge and preparation could silence prejudice, that dignity could defeat doubt, and that truth could shine even when underestimated. As he walked down the steps, he carried not only his stack of papers but also a story that would stay with everyone who had seen it. A story of resilience, of quiet strength, of a man who stood alone yet showed the brilliance of his mind to a world that had doubted him. And somewhere deep inside, the judge who had once laughed at him was left humbled, reminded forever that genius can come from the most unexpected places. The man walked away with his freedom, his dignity, and his head held high, leaving behind a courtroom that would never forget the day it had been stunned into silence by his legal genius.